I'm Jay Udoff. I serve as NAMI New Jersey's Recovery Programs Director, coordinating the various programs in our association directly designed to empower those of us pursuing our own recoveries. For today's webinar, I am serving as the host and moderator of a distinguished panel. Welcome to NAMI New Jersey's Multicultural Conversations webinar series, proudly sponsored by AmeriGroup. For 20 years, AmeriGroup has been committed to the health of all New Jersey communities. Through strategic partnerships with organizations like NAMI New Jersey, AmeriGroup is actively addressing social determinants in a conscious effort to minimize health disparities for underserved and minority populations. NAMI New Jersey is committed to serving New Jersey's diverse communities. We represent the interests of all people affected by mental health conditions, regardless of age, gender, race, or ethnicity, national origin, religion, disability, language, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, or gender. This webinar represents the combined efforts of 3 NAMI New Jersey programs. Our multicultural programs lead the country in efforts to engage the diverse communities and cultures which make up this great state in NAMI activities. Our NAMI Smarts program is designed to empower NAMI members to participate in systems advocacy through outreach to politicians and policymakers. Our Hearts and Minds program operates to raise awareness of the breadth of integrated wellness approaches and to help reduce the serious longevity disparities faced by those of us pursuing recoveries versus the general population. Before we get going, I also want to speak briefly about the difference between individual advocacy and systems advocacy. Individual advocacy is when we speak out on behalf of one person, whether it be ourselves, someone we care about personally, or someone we serve or represent in a professional capacity. Systems advocacy is when we speak out to change a system, a law, a policy, or a practice. NAMI helps empower our members to engage in both individual and systems advocacy, and this is a key component of many NAMI programs. I will also add a brief plug for the In Our Own Voice program, which has a solid research base as a tool to reduce stigma. We love to present all around the state, live and virtually. We have a public webinar coming up at 7 p.m. on the evening of Thursday, December 9th. Please register at the NAMI New Jersey website to hear Vivian and Michael tell their stories of recovery. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to spotlight 4 of the 5 panelists. One of them chooses not to be spotlighted. And I'm going to address a question. And then I think what we'll do is we will go around, we will go to Arnold, then Juliet, then Jennifer, and then M. And basically we're going to ask each question, and you will see some interaction between the panelists because this is not just a static program. So first question is, we have posted your biographies on our website. Please share with the audience in 1 to 2 minutes who you are and what has brought you to NAMI. So we'll start with Arnold and then go to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Jay. I have a loved one with a diagnosis of a major mental illness, and it was living with that experience with my loved one, seeking help from lots of different resources that were not very effective. Finally, with some encouragement from my wife, found NAMI and found that NAMI provided for us many of the tools that we thought were important for both personal advocacy and systems advocacy. And it was through those experiences with our loved one, including experiences with personal advocacy, that brought me to a place where I wanted to use the knowledge that I had from NAMI to engage not only in personal advocacy, but also in systems advocacy to make the systems that we have better for everyone.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer. I am 31 years old, and I'm from Bridgewater, New Jersey. I've lived here my whole life. I am a social worker full-time. I've transitioned to clinical work, but I used to do a lot of program and community organizing. So I, quote unquote, saw how the sausage was made in terms of our mental health programs, some of which could have been done a lot better, right? But I came to NAMI not as a professional, but as somebody with lived experience. So I am one of the In Our Own Voices presenters that Jay was talking about. So I get to go throughout the state of New Jersey and talk about my life as somebody in recovery, as a suicide attempt survivor, and as somebody with 12 and a half years sober from opiate addiction as well. So that's part of why I'm advocating, but also I was born with a permanent hearing disability. So I need hearing aids to not only do my job, but just to communicate every day. So I'm at this kind of odd intersection of advocating systemically and individually for mental and physical all at the same time. And we're going to talk about how that all just, it overlaps a lot. And it's very complicated. So.
Thank you. Juliet?
Hello, my name is Juliet Heineman, and I am Arnold's wife. One thing he didn't mention is that we live in Warren County, which is it's a predominantly rural area, and so it presents some unique challenges. I found NAMI after, I suppose, our loved one was first diagnosed, and I found NAMI, I would say, 13 years later. And unfortunately, you know, my bio will say that our loved one ended up in the criminal justice system because of a botched crisis intervention. And so the silver lining from that experience was that I learned about NAMI. And from there, we were able to add on a plethora of skills and through education, the family to family course, which was a lifesaver. And from there, I consider myself a professional volunteer. And most people, you know, are in the workforce. And so I have a unique position to attend a lot of systems meetings, the mental health boards, the systems review committee. So I've been learning a lot about how resources are dispersed and how we can better it. So that's who I am.
Thank you. And M?
Hi, everyone. I apologize for remaining anonymous. I'll actually get into why that is because it's part of the panel discussion and that actually relates to some of the questions there. But I am M. I have been volunteering at NAMI for almost 2 years now. I am I guess some would consider me a peer in NAMI, as in I'm a person with lived experience with mental health condition, and I've come a long way, and it's been a long healing journey, and I'm grateful for that. And I just want to, I came to NAMI really to assist anybody I could. I wanted to get involved with volunteering in some way, and what better way to volunteer than something you have experience in? That's really the best way to volunteer, right? Not to say anything against any other forms of volunteering, but I came to NAMI and I was kind of greeted with open arms and a very kind of loving and warm atmosphere. And it grew from there. I participated in many panel discussions. I've run support groups. I've even met with individuals on an individual basis to help people who have gone through similar conditions that I have gone through. You know, I am relatively young. I mean, I'm 23 and I'm still in school. I'm still trying to finish up school. So that presents somewhat unique challenges because unfortunately there's only so much I can do when I'm kind of bounded by society's stigma on these mental health conditions. And therefore I can only help so much on such a level because I still have a career to set up and security to set up that unfortunately could be at risk if I share too much of my information, which is unfortunately very personal and can have conflicts with other goals that I have, which is really an unfortunate case scenario, which also explains the anonymity of my name here. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask the panelists, and perhaps a 2 to 3 or 4 minute answer, to describe personal and/or systems advocacy efforts you have been involved in, which involve the intersection of physical health, mental health, and culture. So we'll start.
Okay. You know, that's a great question, Jay, in part because all of us have so many levels and layers in our lives and in how we are viewed and how we view the world. Just to give you an example, M described himself as an individual with lived experience, and I would agree with that. I would call him an individual who lives with first level lived experience, in that, you know, he lives daily with the challenges of overcoming his particular diagnosis. I would think of myself and my wife as someone with second degree lived experiences. While we don't have the diagnosis, we have in our lives been impacted by a loved one who has that experience. And as a result of that, it has altered and changed our life and our view. And so I have been involved in advocacy from a personal perspective in trying to ensure that the system would provide the best possible care for my loved one, particularly during times of crisis. And seeing some of the failures and having to believe that those failures were not particular to my son. And that's one of the issues that all of us have to struggle with. As a person of color, when I have a particular reaction to what I am trying to promote, at least internally, I have to ask the question, is this because of stigma about mental illness? Is this a failure of the system? Or is this a result of me being a person of color and facing some kind of insensitivity, if not outright racism? And so as a person of color, you always go through, or at least I do, those kinds of questions in my own mind and have to resolve them. And that's part of why through NAMI, and I've also become a teacher in the NAMI Smarts program, I've become a strong advocate for trying to change the policies and practices in our county, as well as in the state, that impact both those with a first level lived experience like M or my loved one, or those of us who are family and friends who are impacted by this situation and want to make it better for our loved one. And so I have found challenges in both, in people responding to me as I advocate for my loved one with sort of a level of, well, your family member, you don't know what's best, or a system that simply isn't responsive to the needs of both individuals in a particular circumstances, or are not responsive in general to the plight of those who struggle daily to overcome mental illness.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
So my advocacy started at an individual level, mostly in school, higher education. And as I was saying before, I had to advocate for accommodations for my disability. So for example, I needed videos to have subtitles on them, or I needed notes transcribed, things like that. But I also had to advocate for things for my depression, my anxiety, my sobriety as well. And one thing I kind of found, and we're going to get into this later, is that I found that my physical disability, for whatever reason, well, due to stigma, was almost more acceptable and more sympathetic when I needed accommodations, because I was born with it, because there was nothing I could do about it. But there's so much stigma about mental health and addiction, and people out there still think that these ways of living are a choice that I brought upon myself. So when I ask for accommodations with that, I do get more pushback or just judgment, like, oh, well, maybe, you know, your disability is one thing because you were born with it, you can't help it, but your other diagnoses, I don't know, like, how hard are you working on them? And it's very weird to be compartmentalized and to have parts of yourself that are like worthy of accommodation and services and parts of you that are not, and kind of finding that weird balance. But anyway, I've transitioned to, I guess, systems level advocacy, but I feel like every time I'm advocating at the systems level, I'm still advocating at an individual level, because I'm always advocating for services that I either needed once upon a time, or I could very well have needed if I didn't get into recovery when I did. So for me, it's always personal. I've just become a little bit more loud about it. But I've encountered the same issue with like what people are willing to put up with or provide in the systems level as well. So when we're talking about disability, I recently started doing systems level advocacy work, particularly in Atlantic City, because I was in support of the syringe access program remaining open. And I encountered a lot of stigma because even though, you know, chronic hepatitis and HIV and those types of things are chronic diseases that need prevention funding and treatment funding, it was very much like, oh, well, they brought that on themselves by doing what they're doing. So it was seen as less sympathetic and acceptable than the disability that I've been talking about. So that's just something I've kind of been mulling over. And it's weird that I see it individually and macro as well. So.
Thank you. And Juliet?
My experience in both individual advocacy and systems advocacy has always been, I guess, measured, and my effectiveness has been measured to the degree that I am educated about mental illness and the system. And so when I first was thrusted into this world of mental illness with my loved one, those first 13 years was very traumatic for myself. And so as a second level person of lived experience, that has affected my own mental health to a degree. And so it's always been a juggling challenge for me to maintain my own well-being and yet be effective for my loved one. As I've navigated through the system, as my husband had mentioned, we've learned that a lot of the things that our loved one is encountering is common. But of course, we always have to ask ourselves, and one day there will be a time when we don't, but there's always this question, am I getting, am I hitting the wall because, again, of what other bias, besides the systemic problems? And so that's something we always have to encounter. And the thing that I want to share, it's going to always be with us. And so it doesn't serve me well to keep languishing on that, but just to push forward and find the truth in every situation and to meet people where they are. On a systems level, I've had to face a lot of challenges in the area of trying to break through the inertia of a system. I've found out that, the system is a labyrinth. The mental health system is a labyrinth of bureaucracy. And oftentimes when I, as a citizen advocate, speak and suggest things, I encounter a lot of, I guess the first level is just, complacency and, oh, this is the way it is. It's always going to be difficult, la-di-da-di-da. And I'm not willing to settle for those answers. And because people's lives, are dependent on them. I see it on a regular basis. And so these are human beings who need help, who are hurting. And I guess I just won't settle for those answers. And so I get resistance when I push hard. And I'm not sure if it's because they have put me in a box. I'm a woman. I come off as very non-threatening at first. And I mean, I'm not loud and boisterous. And so when I come with a strong position and I'm unrelenting at sometimes, that's when people start to, you know, get defensive. And I'm constantly trying to find this middle ground, because on the one hand, I am sensitive to the fact that, you know, these people who work in the system are good people. They do care. They're attached to a job. It's their life. It's their benefits, you know, whatever. And, you know, I don't want to come across as being insensitive to their position as well. So my hope is that we can reimagine. You know, I'm so glad that NAMI is speaking and is in the forefront about reimagining mental health services and the delivery of crisis, because we're at a precipice in time where, you know, we need to take advantage of you know, for instance, the 988 rollout and all of the funding that's attached to that legislation. So I want to continue to advocate NAMI's position of reimagining a system that really works.
Thank you. And Em?
Yeah, so this is a great question, right? And Jennifer had mentioned this. She said, I think she had mentioned that. She said, kind of like if you have lived experience with something, you kind of always begin by advocating for yourself. That's more or less going to be the case. However, there's another part of the story, which is that people can advocate for you, like family, which is the case of the other two panelists right here, Julia and Arnold. So as an individual, I was lucky that I was functional enough to advocate for myself, but I also had a lot of family supporting me. So that's a big part of my story. But the interesting thing about, you know, systems versus individual advocacy is that transformation on the individual level is kind of what leads to transformation on a systemic level. But the problem is the reverse is also true. Transformation on a systemic level leads to transformation on an individual level. And if we get too far into what causes what, it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. We just kind of have to attack whatever we can, right? I've participated in other panel discussions before without being anonymous. I've worked with other individuals, and I know part of this question implies the intersection of physical health, mental health, and culture. There's various complications with all these subjects, but we know that they're all interrelated. And the complications kind of arise in which we don't know how to identify what is what. And this is one of the problems I discussed prior to a previous panel discussion, is that do we even know how to define mental health? Do we even know what is defining mental health? How many people in society know what mental health conditions are? So many people probably don't. So many people don't know the different types, the variety, the causes, the complications around them. And that plays a big role in systems and individual advocacy and systems advocacy, because the problem is, if people don't even know what a mental health condition is, we have mental health as an umbrella term, and a lot of people will run to anxiety and depression, but they don't know the subcategories or the different other categories, or some chronic cases that are really particularly egregious or pernicious. You know, whether it's schizophrenia or psychosis or bipolar. Do we know what those mean, or what are the causes of those things? How individuals who have these things interact with society? I think that's a question we have to ask, and I think and that's a question we've asked before on a previous panel discussion with a company that wanted a few individuals to speak, and it brings to light a concern, which is we just don't have people who are knowledgeable enough on the subject, that I think is. In order to see where all these things meet, we just need, it comes out of the classic case of shining light on ignorance. And unfortunately, we wait sometimes until, you know, things really hit the fan for us to understand that, okay, we need to address these issues. And this is kind of what's been happening, right, over time, is that historically what happens with human beings is kind of we see a problem and then we address it. but there's probably many periods of time where we're just constantly repressing or not acknowledging a problem for whatever reason. And then that just makes things worse until we have to address it. And I think we're at a crossroads here where we have the intelligence as humanity as a whole and a society as a whole to bring about changes. And we can do this without without waiting till a very destructive moment to happen. And then the other thing I want to address on an individual level is that individual advocacy is a bit difficult because, especially for a person my age, when you're young, you're trying to build up who you are. You're trying to build up your career. You're trying to build up your relationships. And it's a very precarious and sensitive place to be in because not everybody is mature yet, or the people you're dealing with, the systems, the institutions, the colleges, the universities, what have you, they're not fully knowledgeable about these issues regarding mental health. So that is another issue that comes to mind when I think of individual advocacy. And when I've advocated for myself, that I've run into other barriers, which include being honest about my condition, which is hard because there's, not everybody understands, whether it's, people outside of immediate family or relatives or what have you. Another problem is, trying to get accommodations that are not there presently in my institution. The institutions so far have been good. Like Rutgers University, which I attend, is very good about this, I think. But there are some complications that I had and some interactions that I had that kind of tainted my view a little bit. But generally, I don't want to bash on them because they are generally pretty good. And the other thing I would say is that finally, when it comes down to individual advocacy, it comes down to confidence in the individual himself and knowing, that you have something that you have to live with, and that you have to be honest about it, at least to yourself. So I want to end with that.
Thank you. And I just want to throw one quick PS out to the room that there's a decent research base on the flavor that M takes about the benefits of having a career established before disclosing. One of the often cited works on the topic is Otto Wall, who himself has supported a lot of research on NAMI's anti-stigma program. Otto Wall's book entitled Telling is Risky Business. So let's go back around the loop. And the question I'm going to put, again, for 2 to 4 minutes to each panelist is, please describe challenges you have faced in your advocacy efforts and steps you have taken to overcome them. So again, we start with Arnold, please.
Thank you. I would say that one of the interesting challenges, and I want to relate some of Jennifer's story, if I might, a little bit with what M has shared to try and articulate some of the challenges that I think I have personally faced. One of them, as M alluded to, is the challenge of knowledge, or more importantly, the general ignorance of much of the population about the nature of mental illness. And Jennifer's story seems to highlight that very well, as she, in her own experience, observed the difference between her response to what others would consider a physical deficit versus the mental health challenges that she has, although we know that in many cases, mental health issues have a strong and powerful biological component. But also, I think it is also because of society's fear and concern about wellness of the mind. Because if one were to have a deficit like a hearing deficit that one was born with, you would expect, and our society is very compassionate about it. But I have even seen our society be compassionate about individuals who lost their hearing because, let's say, they went to rock concerts too often and it damaged their eardrum. There's still a great deal of sympathy to that, even though that was environmental, maybe a choice, maybe not a choice. But I have seen in my advocacy with mental illness that there isn't that willingness to extend that same level of compassion and understanding. Some of that is because of ignorance, I believe, not knowing that there is a strong and powerful biological component to many major mental illnesses. And two, I also believe it's because of fear. I think in our society, there's that fear of the unknown, or maybe the fear that if I don't understand it, it might happen to me or one of my loved ones. And so I have found in the area of both personal and systems advocacy, the big challenge has been getting people to have an understanding about the underlying issues and why we are advocating for change. What is it really like to live with this challenge, and to understand that in many cases, these individuals are in this place not because of choices that they have made, any more than we choose our ethnicity, our gender, or the family that we're born into. And as a result, I have found that to be particularly challenging in personal advocacy. But also, I think in system advocacy, the challenge can also be seen there because I think many individuals, even those who are part of the system, have the belief, well, we're doing the best we can, but there's so little hope for these individuals. Let's just try to manage from crisis to crisis. And it's certainly my view that as a system, and as a society, that's not good enough.
Thank you. Jennifer?
That is a tough act to follow. And I agree with so much of what you said. I would echo so much of that. I see it all the time at work. So you're hitting the nail on the head. In terms of challenges I've overcome, some of my co-panelists have alluded to these already. I guess one that comes to mind is, everybody on this panel is representing intersectional identities. So we're not just a family member or someone with lived experience. We're also bringing race, ability, class, gender into what we're presenting as. But I've noticed that when I'm recruited to be involved in a program design or grant application, I'm only recruited because I check a box for them, and that I am a suicide attempt survivor only, and they're working on a suicide prevention project, but they only want to hear that side of my story. But if I go in saying, hey, you should also make sure that your program materials are accessible to people with different disabilities and this and that, they're like, all right, well, you're only here for that one part of your story. And also I found that I feel like an afterthought in those situations. I have found that people who are applying for grants or putting these programs together, they already know up here what they want to do. And then they invite people with lived experience as like an afterthought, just so they can be like, oh, well, this person who's been through X, Y, and Z thinks it's a good idea, so we're good. And in reality, people like me and everybody on this panel need to be involved from the beginning of when things are being rolled out and planned and all of that. And another thing, I think Juliet kind of hinted at this, I think it was the previous question, is how do we not take it personally when we're advocating, even at a systems level? These are such personal issues for ourselves, right? Because personal, at least for the people I'm on this panel with, that's what brought us here to NAMI, are these things that we've been dealing with personally. Like, how do we not take it personally when people are saying horrible things about the issues that we or our loved ones have been going through or have really ruined our loved ones' lives? How do you not take that personally? And as far as steps to overcome that, one thing that has helped is that I usually don't advocate by myself. I'm usually involved with other advocacy coalitions or networks. NAMI is one of them. So if there is a time that I need to tap out of an initiative, it is just too much, I could feel myself taking it personally, I can just turn to another advocate and be like, I think I'm done with this. I need a break for a few hours, but the work isn't done and we can keep moving. That has been really helpful because relationships are everything in advocacy, and I could very easily damage one by just totally exploding with all of my frustration, all my taking it personally if I'm like testifying at a meeting or something. So if I feel myself about to do that, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to step away. Somebody else can say what I'm trying to say, because in the end of the day, I'm not going to be able to not take it personally. So I need to know when to take a break. So that's, I don't know, it's hard, but that's helped me kind of balance that.
Thank you. And Juliet?
Unmute. Yes. Just listening to the previous panelists, I want to speak about stigma. That's one of the biggest challenges that I find I have to overcome, both on an individual advocacy level and also from a systems. On an individual basis, if you read my bio, you know, my faith informs a lot of how I respond to things and situations. And so I've, you know, unfortunately, in my experience in the faith community, there's a lack of understanding about what mental illness is. And what's frustrating is because the mental health field, because of stigma, I think, motivated because of the stigma, in fact, perpetuates the stigma by not calling a mental illness an illness. You know, if in fact we believe that, and we're trying to, you know, deconstruct the pejorative word of mental illness and try to educate the public that this is a physical illness, it's the brain that's affected, then the first thing we have to do is challenge even professionals to call it illness. It's an illness, and we ought to be proud. I don't know about that. We need to be proud of it because it deserves the serious treatment of that it is. And because it isn't, oftentimes it's not treated that way. Oftentimes the limited funds that are being given are being taken by activities or programs that are not serving the mentally ill, those who are really need help with mental illness, and instead going to wellness programs. And I'm not faulting them, but there seems to be a disparity and an unbalance. And from my point of view, the population who has been underserved is continually being underserved because of this stigma that even the mental health community is contributing to. Okay, so that's one of the frustrations that I have. And then the second thing is, I guess, again, it goes back to the bureaucracy. And I tend to see on a systems level, professionals tend to be isolated in their own niche. And so they become complacent with the way things are. I'll give you an example. We live in a rural community, and we don't have a mental health hospital in our county. And we don't have behavioral units in our hospitals. So most people who end up in a crisis end up in the emergency rooms first. And this month, since COVID started, we've just had high escalating numbers coming into the emergency room. But not only that, they have been staying in the hospital the emergency room more than 72 hours. And the numbers have been steadily increasing. Add to that, you know, they all have their TLCs, which is, and that's another thing, the acronyms that are just spoken of, you know, as if it's regular words. Someone like myself, that's another challenge, is trying to understand the system when the professionals speak in acronyms. And the acronyms can mean different things. They'll have the same letters, but they'll mean different things. And so, you know, when I attend these meetings, I have to overcome this image, you know, of me feeling as if here I am again, this dummy, you know, but for the sake of trying to understand, I have to push through that. That's very frustrating. And so we have a scenario where there are beds that exist around the state, but there's not transportation, ambulances to get them there. And so, you know, there's this timing thing where you have to write the orders or whatever, but then if a certain amount of time lapses, then you start from square one again. And that poor person who needs help is suffering. And that's, to me, that's unacceptable. And yet I asked, well, can the DMHAS get involved with this? Because there's one hospital that has been a problem, that an ambulance company will not service to that hospital because they do intake in the ambulance as opposed to doing the intake in the hospital. Now, this has been going on for years, so much so that this ambulance company refuses to transport to that hospital. And yet it still goes on. And I challenged, I said, can the department, the division get involved? And they said, yes, they've been involved. It's being taken care of. Well, for me, I'm saying that's too slow. That's too slow. And yet the system seems to accept it. And so there needs to be an outcry from the public. But if the public is not educated, if the public gives way to the stigma, then, you know, it's like, you know, Em was talking about the egg, you know, is it the chicken or the egg or whatever? The bottom line is I have to just do the best where I am and pray that other people will do likewise. And that pretty much sums it up. That keeps me sane.
TYVM, Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
So Em?
First of all, I'd like to say everything these panelists are saying is just wonderful. I mean, it's clear that they've done the best that they could, and they're going to continue doing the best that they can to help everybody. And I can just sense the growth that's going to come out of this conversation for people who are watching, and just for me myself. I want to touch on something Arnold said real quick. He talked about how these illnesses are biological, and the other aspect is the environmental aspect and choices, right? And I don't know about you guys, but I made some bad choices in my life. Why is it that we're only compassionate to the bad choices we're comfortable with? Like, okay, my family makes this bad choice, but that family, they made other bad choices, so I'm not going to be compassionate about their bad choices. Well, hold on. Some people get into substances. Some people have different kinds of addictions. Some people have problems we don't even know about. And we look, our compassion can't be limited to the choices that we are aware of, okay? People make bad decisions, and you know what? They learn from it, they grow, and there's all kinds of cause and effect that is related to those quote unquote bad decisions. And you know what? Our compassion cannot be restricted to anybody just because they made a bad decision. Okay, and that applies systemically, in basically ubiquitously. That is a ubiquitously applied rule. So I just want to strongly emphasize that point. The other thing I want to talk about is, you know, when I think about advocacy, I think about some of the other individuals who have come to me for help, and the limited help that they can get, right? You talk about people, their inability to find a psychiatrist that works with them, their inability to find medications that work for them, their inability to find the right diagnosis, the inability to find people that can help them. And then the inability on my part as a person who is not a professional to give certain forms of help, to give certain forms of recommendations, to express my unconventional methods that I use to help myself, to help other people. There's a lot of things a lot of problems that are run into there. And then there's another one that I want to touch on, which was kind of introduced to me lately, which I wasn't aware of. I'm not a peer engagement specialist per se, but I have helped out peers before. I know of somebody who was my peer engagement specialist, and he was trying, and for those of you who don't know, that is a very unique role in the mental health field. It is a role that you're not LCSW, you're not a licensed therapist, but you are a person with lived experience trying to help other people with lived experience. And he talks about how my peer engagement specialist talked about how peer engagement specialists are underpaid and how there's not that many of them. You know, there's like, if you have a particular diagnosis, like where are you going to find that peer engagement specialist? Do we have a system that is in place to get people the right peers so that they get people, they don't just get professionals talking to them on from a certain level? Because, you know, a professional can only talk to you on with a certain kind of expertise and a certain kind of knowledge. A peer has a very different criteria, very different parameters of expertise that are very helpful. So that's another issue that was made aware to me very recently. And then the other forms of advocacy again revolve around subjects we touched upon that I think have some complications, which is you know, fear and inability to be honest. Right? It's difficult. How can I, as an individual who has had problems, who has made bad decisions and also probably has a biological and biologically related, cause to my mental illness. Like the combination of those two mean I sometimes I can't even be honest about why I have what I have, even to somebody in my most direct immediate family. And it's complicated, right? I mean, how do I do that? How do I be honest, you know, as an individual with lived experience to other individuals, be it whether they have lived experience or not? How do I be honest with them? That's very difficult. That's not an easy thing to do, and that honesty principle is a very difficult one all around for anybody who is trying to attempt to help out with advocacy, because you can only reveal so much before you're compromised. You know, you can only reveal so much before you're compromised on some level. And you have to have faith that the person you're revealing it to is going to be of assistance to you and not going to be a huge detriment. So that's another issue. And then when I think about advocacy again, revolving around people, not just me, like other people that I've dealt with. Like, how much do these families know about what their child is experiencing, you know, and where do they get their help from? And you know, how much does a culture, you know about these illnesses, and then we get into the very unique issue, or we call them unique issues, but they kind of are there everywhere, where each culture addresses mental health differently. And so does my culture have it harder than another culture? And then, you know, I'm Indian, and I know that it's said always amongst Indian people that we don't deal with mental health so well. But then I hear that with everybody. Every other culture says the same thing. So basically what we're saying is we as human beings on planet Earth don't deal with mental health so well. We don't know how to deal with it. That's basically what we're saying. That's not to say there aren't unique issues with each culture. There are, 100%. But the thing is, you know, we have to come to a point where we have to realize, one, yes, there are unique issues, and two, everybody systemically, we're just not that conscious about mental health issues. So that's kind of my spiel, and I would also like to add that, you know, it also has to deal with diagnoses, right? So different individuals have different diagnoses, and what works for one individual may not work for another because they have completely different conditions. But the problem is, how about us in the mental health field, people with lived experience and people without lived experience? Like, how much compassion do we have for somebody who has a completely different issue within us, and lives a completely different way and has made completely different choices? Like, I've had that barrier in me where if I'm trying to help people in a support group or something, and I consider myself a pretty open and compassionate person, but I realize I have a barrier within me, which is I have a limited understanding of other people's issues, which grows. I begin to learn and grow more every time I come in contact with these people. But when I'm in a support group, I don't have enough knowledge or expertise about somebody else's issue. I don't unfortunately have enough compassion sometimes because I don't know enough, and I don't know enough about these issues. And it's unfortunate to say that. And I want to try and grow and make sure that I correct that, and then that I begin to be more understanding of other people's mental health conditions. But I think even us within the mental health community, we're probably guilty of not being not being able to be compassionate enough about other people who have other conditions in the mental health community. So I just want to end off with that.
Thank you. I'm actually going to touch on the answer to one question and put one quick PS to that. The question was, what does he mean by peer, person with diagnosis, without diagnosis? So there is an entire field of those of us who live with mental health issues and work in the field and use a combination of professional training and the credibility and empathy that comes from lived experience to play a paraprofessional role in the field. And I have the privilege of training peer professionals in the New York City system, and under the Hearts and Minds umbrella, if there are folks who are interested in a webinar on some of the routes and options and the ethos of peer professionals, that's something we can certainly talk about moving forward with. So going forward, the last of the organized questions, which means that the next set of questions will be those that come forward from the floor or interaction among the panelists. The last question is, what is one lesson you have learned or are still learning in your advocacy efforts, which you think would benefit your fellow active advocates and future advocates who are sitting in this webinar? So again, we'll start with Arnold, please.
I would like to say, and this really dovetails very well on what Im shared with us, that for me, it is twofold. One, to try to increase my knowledge, but more importantly, to try to enhance my compassion. And so, like my wife is a person of faith, one who my faith demands that I try to increase and enhance my compassion for others. And Im spoke very well when he articulated the fact that while we come from different cultural perspectives, and many of us might have multiple perspectives based on our culture, our background. So I have a perspective as a person whose ethnicity is African American. I have that perspective is tainted or influenced by my faith in God through Christ. That experience is tainted by the fact that I am in a multi-ethnic, multicultural marriage. And so all of these things influence what impacts me and how I respond to those situations. But what Im said was very powerful, was in spite of those differences, what he recognized, and I believe we all do, is as human beings, we all have these issues. As human beings, we are all flawed in how we look and treat one another. As human beings, we're influenced by stigma. And that stigma in part is because we all come to this world and our worldviews with some biases. And those biases influence how we interact with people, particularly people who seem to be different than ourselves. And so stigma impacts the fact that we might treat someone with an acceptable physical illness different from someone with a mental illness. But stigma also influences the systems. And Juliet talked a little bit about that, as well as Jennifer, because stigma, and I think Im mentioned this well, stigma also impacts how we spend our money. Stigma influences how we as a society determine where we're going to put our resources. And because this stigma exists in the area of mental illness, as a society, we are not putting the equivalent amount of support into these areas. And I think that is reflective of the fact that as individuals, collectively, we don't have compassion in that area. And so for me, that is a challenge that has to start first individually by looking to increase my own understanding, and through that understanding, greater compassion. And then with that compassion, be willing to work or to advocate for a system that responds with more compassion for those who are receiving less than what they deserve.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Let's see. I have one answer I was going to say for this, and then I have like a second short one that listening to M kind of made me think about. The first one sounds cynical, but it's something I heard in a political science class when I was a freshman in college, which is, and I don't know who said it, and I tried to find out if this quote originated from somebody, and I couldn't. But a professor once said the first rule of politics is never assume they're on your side. And I don't mean to say this as never trust anybody, but I mean to say, especially with the last few elections, a lot of the candidates on both sides started talking more about mental health and addiction recovery supports, and they are saying the right things, right? But when push comes to shove, a lot of the times they will simply just say, okay, well, I'm going to put more money into this system that we all know, especially from listening to Arnold and Juliet, is not a good system. So I'm thinking of people who run for elected positions in the state of New Jersey specifically, who will say, oh, well, this division, this office, this level of care should get more of the budget, that's okay on one hand, but in practice, we see the gaps in transportation and hospital services that Juliet's talking about. So you can funnel money into this one area if you decide to, go ahead with your campaign promise, but you're still throwing money at something that is not doing what we need it to do, right? So that's this difference in what I'm doing as a politician versus how does it actually look on the ground. And that's where advocacy really comes in, is that we have to be the ones to say, hey, that sounds really great, but what this actually looks like is this, and it's not good. And listening to M talk about honesty and anonymity has made me think that it's a slippery slope. When I first started advocating, I wanted to tell like my entire recovery story of how terrible everything was for me. And I found that became at such an expense of my own well-being, because not only is that a lot to share with people, but that's a lot of vulnerability to just expose at the risk of a lot of rejection or judgment, especially as a young person who was starting my career at the same time I started advocating. So the lesson I've learned is that you don't always owe everybody your whole story or your whole tragedy. You can keep some of that for yourself, for your family to process, and you can still be an amazing advocate even if you don't get into the nitty gritty. It's a fine balance, because we want people to understand how serious this is, right? And we want them to understand how dark it can get, but you can still preserve yourself while getting that message across, which is something I still kind of very much struggle with. But it's just a matter of like self-preservation at this point. So that's something I've kind of learned the hard way along the way as an advocate.
Thank you. And Juliet?
Yes. The response that I have is kind of piggybacking off of Arnold and Jennifer's response. One of the things that Jennifer touched on is very powerful recognition about being discreet about what we share, and it's okay. And I just want to say that as NAMI Smarts trainers or instructors, that's one of the main focus that the curriculum is tailored to, is teaching advocates or upcoming advocates how to craft their story. And it's a wonderful experience, because we need to, think about what it is that's germane to a situation. And as Jennifer said, we don't have to reveal everything. And you don't, and it's good not to, because on a legislative level, if you're advocating on that level, they don't have time to hear everything. So you just want to make it two minutes and and make that impact. So the Smarts training is wonderful for that, because it helps us to really think about our lives, but what it is we want to share. And it's okay to not divulge everything. And the second thing that I've learned is, as an advocate, be careful. You don't have to make friends. And in fact, it's important not to make friends. And that has taken off a lot of burden off of me, because I like to be liked, you know, I want to be accepted. But as an advocate, we have to come in there saying, I'm not there to make friends, and I'm not going to offend anybody outright. And I want to be sensitive to people as human beings. But this is a scenario, an arena where we're talking about politics, and politics is not a pejorative, it's the reality. It's about, you know, how authority and power is wielded, and we all have to maneuver that system. So I want to take the stigma off of politics, okay, so that we can really get engaged, because that's where the decisions are made, that's where money is funneled, and that, you know, and so we can't be afraid of politics. But in the political arena, we can't make friends. And so the best I can do, because of my faith informs who I am and how I behave. I say what I say, I mean what I say, and I'm going to do what I say. And that's what I want to be known for. And I won't stab you in the back. So that's my words of wisdom.
Thank you. Sounds quite like the first of the 4 agreements. I'm going to take, before I pass the same question to Em, I've been asked to remind the room that we are scheduled to run to 8:15, so we will have a few minutes for questions. And thank you, Juliet, for cueing me not to try to sneak in with the politician joke, just by your wise comments. Thank you. Em?
Thank you. So I want to repeat one lesson that Jennifer had mentioned, that the same lesson for me, which is that, you know, you don't have to reveal everything. You don't, and you can't. It's not diplomatic, and it's not wise. And I've learned that. At the same time, another lesson I've learned is that I also have to be honest. So I have to be honest, and I also have to be diplomatic. So how do you do that? Well, that's going to differ amongst individuals and their different scenarios, but that's another lesson. I have to be honest. At the very least, I have to be honest with myself. I have to be honest with myself about what's going on. I have to be honest with myself about whether I'm making an impact, whether I'm making a difference. And I know I haven't done enough, and that's another thing. So I have to be honest with myself about that. I know I don't know enough. I know I'm not knowledgeable enough about every single thing about the mental health community. I know really as much as my limited story has given me so far. And that's part of my lesson. Another lesson I want to talk about, which is just about, I think it's something I learned both on my mental health journey and as well as just a good philosophical lesson that kind of regards to anything. And it's kind of centers around whenever we want to fight a system, or whenever we want to fight anything, or there's an institution or a group or a society or a dogma or this or that, anything. It's a lesson that I've learned, it's a spiritual lesson that I've learned. And it's also a lesson that I refer to analogously through the story about, I don't know what form of martial arts this is, but it's an Eastern martial arts. I don't practice martial arts, but I love this little snippet of wisdom, which is that whenever you have an opponent, you take the opponent's energy and you use it against them. You don't fight them you don't drain yourself fighting with your own energy. You take the opponent's energy and you use it against them. And I love that, because I've learned that part of this whole journey in mental health, and part of this whole journey of trying to reform society in the world, is that we have to take in whatever we're getting. We have to take in whatever it is. We have to take in the energy of whatever we're getting so that we can change it. And part of that, the first part of that is acceptance, right? You have to accept that the opponent's arm is coming to you, or you can't dodge it, right? Part of it is acceptance. Part of it is being diplomatic. Part of it is having the wisdom to know that not everything is bad. You know, that's another thing I've learned, is that not everything that the institutions, not everything that the government is doing is bad or sinister or evil. There are good things. So that's another thing. So we have to know what progress we've made. Part of it is knowing that maybe for some people, part of it might be allocating energy, right? Where am I directing my productivity? Where am I directing what I can do best? Where is it not worthy to fight something? Because maybe it's not my fight right now, because there's something better to do. better meaning something more productive for everybody else as humanity as a whole. So I think that lesson can be applied in so many different scenarios, which is that when we're fighting something, we best not become the enemy, right? We best not become the enemy we're fighting. You know, I think there's a Nietzsche quote, Jay, I feel like this is up your alley, which is like, if you stare too long into the abyss also gazes into you, right? Correct me if that's the right quote. And I just want to put in those snippets of wisdom because there's something I've learned along my journey through healing and myself and wanting to help others, which is that one, I'll just reiterate, one, we have to be honest, two, we have to be diplomatic, and three, we have to fight the fight that's right.
Thank you. And in fact, I'm going to thank several of the panelists for the wisdom. I've been doing systems advocacy on behalf of NAMI for 2 decades, and these are lessons that would have come better to me earlier. What I'd actually like to do, because we have one extant question in the Q&A, is use it as a springboard as a last question to the room. So the question was phrased as, how can we improve resources? For example, peers in recovery can visit the peers who are homebound. So I'm going to answer with 2 concepts and then pass it broadly to the panelists. So one way that we improve systems and engage in systems advocacy is through cross curiosity. If you know enough about the system, the public mental health systems, and are reading emails from the peer provider movement, you know that in some states, I think Oregon is a leader in it, peer providers are covered when they provide integrated activity of daily living services to people on Medicaid. And you know that the same thing can happen in New Jersey, and it does happen in our developmental system. So learning from other systems is kind of a general answer. Another was, we learned from technology. We didn't have one Zoom meeting going on 2 years ago. Now, anybody who is pursuing a recovery, doesn't want to come out to a meeting, can come to a meeting, come to a NAMI Connection meeting. Basically each of New Jersey's 25 peer support centers has groups that meet online. You know, Rutgers University Behavioral Healthcare has 7 different peer provider lines, specialized lines. So having mentioned these things, and that's me, the fact magnet, I want to use it as kind of a last question for the panel and say, if you wanted to go after something, would it be a specific thing? Would it be a stretch goal? Would it be a piece of low-hanging fruit? Right now, you know, so we'll start with Arnold and go around using that as a generalizing question. What would you go after?
Well, for me, I think that it's probably a broad thing. It's not low-hanging fruit. But for me, the issue is put in the simple word parity. I would want parity in support and funding for the issues that we care about. So, you know, there are systems in place for home health care nurses to come to help the aged, to come to the homes to visit individuals while they're recovering from stroke or heart attack. We should have the same degree of resources for individuals who are providing support for those who are in recovery for a major mental illness. And so that's the issue that I think I would go for. In a simple word, it's parity.
Thank you. Jennifer?
An issue I think that kind of is connected to everything we've been talking about is the lack of communication between like the direct service professionals, their supervisors, the people who make decisions and allocate funding, the people who vote on budgets, and also with the clients and the families. None of these levels are talking to each other. So I think people at the top can be like, oh, well, we fund transportation for our Medicaid clients. They have logistic care. They have this, they have that. It's fine. And it never trickles up to them that, hey, my son was outside the psych hospital for 4 hours because their ride didn't show up and it was snowing and I'm homebound and I could not drive them. So these fragments and services at the top, they don't see the specific ways that it's falling apart, or the people who are on the ground doing the work can see how broken it is, but their supervisors are in an office all day, not interacting with people who are using the programs directly, so they lose sight of what this looks like in practice. So we're all just not communicating with each other, and maybe it's just, hey, who has the time to do that and keep everybody on the same page? But like, that's the gap I really see, is that we're all so fragmented and stuck in our own little niche area. And that's why like my advocacy work helps break me out of that, because I get to talk to the family members and the policymakers and everything, but not everybody has the time for that. So I guess just this total breakdown in communication and what our system actually looks like is just so detrimental to making sure things are done correctly.
And I know that if we weren't watching the clock, we could have a great set of follow-on questions and conversation about some of the roles in which the committees on which some of us serve, our professional society organizations, do play a role in giving those of us in the trenches at different levels access to the folks at the top of the in the executive branch side of mental health. Juliet?
Yeah. Because of time limitations, I want to make a plug. And that is for the here and now, we need to take advantage of what NAMI has provided in terms of being a conduit to bring in all kinds of voices and perspectives. I don't know if you had a chance to take in the webinar series that just happened last week or so, the Reimagine series that they sponsored for, it was a conference actually. I want to encourage all of us to go to the site and listen to the recordings. There were so many great ideas that they tried to address, people who have been through it, models that are working. And we in New Jersey can really, truly glean from that. But what we need is we need something to bring people together and to, like Jennifer was mentioning, sit down and really look at the system. And the hindrance I feel is people are protecting their system, what it is. They don't want to fully expose what we are in order to bring something, put something back better. They want to just kind of add on, And so what happens is that there's always the possibility, and usually it is, that there's a redundancy in one area and a lack in another, because there hasn't been a systematic evaluation of what is going on. And so that's what I want to see to improve the services in New Jersey.
Thank you. And adding on to what Juliet said, this is another one of those things that we can learn totally cross systems. When people talk about healthcare systems, they talk about the difficulty removing the unworking pieces. When people talk about law enforcement systems, they have the same conversation. When people talk about civic planning, they talk about it. So, we can, the more we're curious across programs, across state and national lines, we learn a lot from the research internationally. And finally, Em, what's your thought about where you'd go if I set you loose on something specific?
Well, I haven't engaged in these yet, but I think there's two things that I'd love to see. One is I would love to see. Here's the problem: when individuals have an illness of sorts, sometimes they have to be their own healer. And I want the widestream medical establishment to provide every possible method for healing for anybody who has an issue. So if it's an unconventional method, which sometimes is unconventional, see if it works, you know, as long as it's not detrimental, right? I'm not talking about something dangerous, but if there's unconventional method that could potentially heal people and it's not widely established yet, let's see if we can research that, see if that works. So that's one thing. And I'm sure there's a lot of research going on about that. I'm positive there is. The second thing is, I wish we were taught about this stuff more in school. I really wish, and I did two subjects. One, I wish they talked about drugs, and not just drugs are bad, but I wish they talked about just the reality of substance use and the reality of what can happen with substance use. The actual reality, not just drugs are bad, the actual reality, because they played a role in my life, unfortunately, not through addiction, but through, unfortunately, they triggered mental illness. But I wish that we talked about mental illness more in school from a young age, I think. From a young age, or at least the age where people are mature enough. So that's first thing. And the second thing is the substances. Like, can we get an honest conversation about what substances do? Any substance, every substance. What does it do? Right? Some substances they say are good now. Well, hold on. I had that experience. I thought that was true. And then now I'm seeing that it's not good for everybody. So that's one thing. Let's talk about mental illness in school, right? Let's talk about what is depression. What does it mean to be depressed? What's it like to be depressed? What does it mean that you feel like when you say you're losing your mind? What does that mean? Well, let's talk about this, right? Let's have an ongoing discussion. Let's have children talk to each other. You know, sometimes let's have a place where you can have an honest support group in a school. You know. I'm not sure if that's the best place. Maybe it's not the most appropriate. Maybe I'm not knowledgeable about that subject. But let's talk about it. Let's say there's support groups in school where peers can talk to each other. People maybe they know. You know, let's just see whatever is possible so that we can educate and heal people from a young age onwards, so that they're equipped to handle anything when they get older and to help other people when they get older.
Sounds good. Sounds like Em would be a fan of the session we have available in Hearts and Minds called 67 Ways to Treat Depression That Do Not Come on a Prescription. You know, and that's part of the systems problem of there's lots of things out there, every one of which, by the way, of those 67 things is supported by research, not wild ideas. But if we're not telling people about them, then they're not finding them. So thank everybody for hanging in. I thank the panel for your wisdom, your insight, and your openness. And I encourage everybody in attendance to pay attention to the announcements of the various webinar series. You will see the monthly multicultural conversations. And of course, our various other programs. I encourage you to consider how to get involved in Smarts. Consider how to get involved in your local affiliate. Your local affiliate needs people to do the things that Juliet is talking about, to serve on county mental health board or acute care systems review committee or county interagency coordinating council, or the co-occurring disorder task force that exists in many counties to try to break some of the silo between mental health and substance treatment, or get involved in our programs that are there to try to advocate for more education in the school. So many hands make lighter work. I dare not say light work. And again, thank you all for hanging in and have a healthy night. All right, everybody.